The village woke the way it always did, slowly, with a kind of deliberate reluctance, as though it preferred to linger in sleep rather than face the small exertions of the day. Snow lay over everything like a thoughtful pause, not deep enough to cause trouble, not fresh enough to excite comment, just present, smoothing edges and muting sound. Cars were few and moved carefully along the single main road, tires whispering rather than crunching. Smoke rose from chimneys in narrow, patient lines. Curtains were drawn back inch by inch, revealing kitchens where kettles were already singing and radios murmured to themselves. In luck-dub winter did not arrive with drama. It settled in and made itself comfortable. Hamish Macbeth stood at the front window of the police station, hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone slightly stewed. He watched Mrs. McLean shuffle past, with her terrier tucked under one arm, both of them wearing expressions of mild grievance at the cold. He noted, without thinking much about it, that she usually passed at precisely 10 minutes to 9. Today she was late. Time in the village had its own texture. People pretended not to notice patterns, but they did. They noticed who was early, who was late, who had not appeared at all. Hamish took a sip of tea and grimaced. He made a mental note to brew the next pot properly, then promptly forgot about it. His attention drifted instead to the notice board opposite his desk, where outdated announcements curled at the corners, a postponed bingo night, a missing casserole dish that had never been found, a faded flyer advertising rooms to let. He had meant to take that one down weeks ago. The rooms belonged to the old house at the edge of the village, the one that crouched near the frozen burn as though Eve. It had been empty for years before the stranger arrived, late in the autumn, just as the hills were losing their color. No one could quite remember seeing him come, only that one day the house lights were on, and the next there was a man buying bread and milk at the shop as if he had always done so. He was quiet, the stranger, polite in a careful way, as though each word had been weighed before being released. He spoke with no discernible accent that anyone could confidently place, which made people suspicious in a gentle, conversational manner. Mrs. Harris from the post office said he sounded English. Mr. from the hotel insisted he heard something continental. Hamish thought he sounded tired. Snow had arrived shortly after that, not all at once, but in small, persistent offerings. The stranger stayed. When the first real storm came and the road south closed overnight, people assumed he would leave as soon as it reopened. He did not. He bought firewood. He asked about the weather as though it mattered deeply. He learned the shop's opening hours and never arrived outside them. "Morning," said Hamish, to no one in particular, as the door opened and closed behind him. He pulled on his hat and stepped outside, the cold meeting him with brisk familiarity. He walked down the road at an unhurried pace, nodding at those he passed. Each greeting was returned, though a few were accompanied by glances that lingered just a fraction longer than usual. At the shop, the bell gave its tired ring. Inside, the air smelled of bread and damp wool. Mrs. Harris looked up from behind the counter, her mouth already shaped for speech. "He hasn't been in," she said. Hamish raised an eyebrow. "Good morning to you, too," she sniffed. "You know who I mean." "I might," said Hamish, mildly, "but you'll have to tell me anyway." "The man from the big house? He's in every other day. Same things. Today, nothing." Hamish glanced at the shelf where the bread usually sat. One loaf remained, lonely and untouched. He felt, rather than thought, a small shift in the air between them. "Maybe he's sleeping in," he said. Mrs. Harris leaned closer, lowering her voice, though there was no one else in the shop. "In this weather, with that fire, he keeps so low you can barely see the smoke." Hamish bought a newspaper. He did not intend to read and stepped back outside. The village seemed unchanged, but it had taken on the quality of a held breath. Conversations paused and resumed behind him. Someone laughed, a little too loudly. He found himself walking, without having decided to, toward the old house. His boots left shallow prints that would be gone by afternoon. The path was narrow and not often used, hedged in by snow-laden gorse. The house itself looked much as it always had. Gray stone, dark windows, a suggestion of warmth that felt theoretical rather than real. The door was closed. No smoke rose from the chimney. Hamish stood for a moment, listening. There were no sounds from inside, but then there rarely were. He knocked gently, once, then again. The sound seemed to vanish into the wood. He did not feel alarm. Not exactly. It was more like the sensation of reaching for something familiar and finding it not where it should be. By the time he turned back toward the village, he knew that by lunchtime everyone would know the stranger had not been seen. By evening, they would be remembering things they had not thought important at the time. Small kindnesses, small oddities, the way he had watched the snow as though it were telling him something, and locked up, warm behind its curtains and teacups, would begin quietly, carefully to wonder. By midday the snow had softened, losing its earlier resolve and turning to a pale slush at the edges of the road. The village adjusted accordingly. Boots were exchanged for sturdier ones. Conversations lengthened. There was an unspoken agreement that nothing urgent was to be done until after lunch. Hamish returned to the police station long enough to hang up his coat and abandon the newspaper on his desk, then wandered back out again, following the gentle pull of habit. Looked-up revealed itself best when one walked without purpose. That was when people forgot to censor themselves. At the hotel, the lunch crowd was thin. Mr. McPhee stood behind the bar, polishing a glass that was already spotless. He looked up as Hamish entered, his expression settling into something cautiously conversational. "Haven't seen your friend today," he said. Hamish leaned an elbow on the bar. "He's not my friend." Mr. McPhee shrugged. "Everyone's someone's friend. Sooner or later, he usually comes in for soup when it's cold." "Did he say anything yesterday?" Hamish asked. "Only that winter lingers longer here than people expect." Mr. McPhee snorted softly. "As if we didn't know." Hamish smiled faintly, but stored the remark away. People rarely said exactly what they meant, but they often said something adjacent to it. Outside again, he found Mrs. McLean standing in the street, her terrier now on the ground and straining at its lead as if determined to reach somewhere specific. "He pulled like that all morning," she said, without greeting. "Wouldn't settle." "Dogs do that," Hamish replied. "Aye, but not usually toward the old house." Hamish looked down the road, where the gray stone roof was just visible beyond the bend. "Did you go there?" "Of course not. I've no business bothering a man who likes his peace." The terrier barked once, sharp and insistent, then fell silent. Hamish thanked her and moved on. By early afternoon, the village had developed a rhythm of speculation. Nothing loud or dramatic, just small exchanges that passed like notes slid across a table. The stranger's Namor Lakawan was discussed with renewed interest. Someone remembered he had paid in exact change. Someone else recalled that he never used the fireplace in the sitting room, preferring the smaller one in the back. It was Mrs. Wallace who finally gave shape to the unease. She intercepted Hamish outside the post office, her cheeks pink with cold and purpose. "You should check on him properly," she said. "It's not right, him staying up there alone like that." "I did check," Hamish said. He didn't answer. "Well then," she folded her arms. "That's your answer, isn't it?" Hamish did not argue. Instead, he walked back toward the old house, this time with intention. The path seemed longer, though he knew it was not. Snowmelt dripped from branches, the sound too loud in the quiet. He knocked again, firmer now. When there was still no response, he tried the handle. It turned easily. Inside, the house was cold but not abandoned. A coat hung neatly by the door. Boots stood side by side beneath it, clean and well cared for. The air carried the faint scent of peat and something medicinal. Hamish stepped inside, calling out softly. His voice felt intrusive. He did not search. There was no need. The house offered itself up in small, honest details. A kettle on the stove, empty but recently used, a book face down on the table, its spine cracked at the middle. In the back room, the smaller fireplace held the remains of a fire that had burned low and gone out without protest. The stranger lay on the narrow bed, hands folded, expression peaceful in a way that left no room for doubt. Hamish stood for a long moment, hat in his hands, listening to the silence settle into something permanent. There was no sign of struggle, no drama. Just the quiet end of something that had been running out for some time. By the time Hamish returned to the village, the news had arrived ahead of him. It always did. People paused as he passed, their faces composed into appropriate seriousness. Doors opened and closed with care. Mrs. Harris pressed a cup of tea into his hands without a word. Mr. McPhee nodded once, his mouth set. Even the terrier sat quietly at his owner's feet. "He's dead, then," someone said, not unkindly. "Yes," Hamish replied. "How?" Hamish considered peacefully. That seemed to satisfy most of them. Locked up, had little appetite for tragedy. Peaceful was something they could understand. That evening, lights glowed warm against the early dark. Suppers were eaten with an extra chair left empty in thought rather than practice. The stranger became a collection of remembered moments, assembled carefully and without malice. Hamish sat alone at his desk as night settled in, the village breathing around him. He wrote his report slowly, choosing his words with care. Outside, snow began to fall again, light and persistent, covering the day's disturbances. Somewhere between sentences, Hamish found himself thinking not of how the man had died, but of why he had stayed, and he suspected that the answer lay not in the house at the edge of the village, but in the village itself waiting patiently, as it always did, to be understood. The following morning arrived with a deceptive brightness, the sort that made the snow sparkle, and gave the impression that nothing unfortunate had ever occurred. Locked Up responded in kind. People opened their curtains wider. Children were sent out with scarves pulled high and instructions to be careful. Life, as ever, leaned toward continuation. Hamish rose early, though he had slept poorly. Not from worry exactly, but from a low, persistent awareness, like a tune one could not quite place. He brewed his tea properly this time and carried it to the window, watching the village reassemble itself. Patterns returned, though altered at the edges. The stranger's house sat empty again, but not in the way it had before. There was a difference between vacancy and absence. The villagers felt it, even if they would not have said so aloud. By mid-morning, the doctor had come and gone, and the matter had been settled officially, in terms that were adequate, if not illuminating. There was no suspicion of violence, no urgency. What remained was not a case so much as a question, and Hamish had learned that questions like these were rarely answered by procedure. He went first to the shop, not because he expected to learn anything new, but because it was where people gathered when they wanted to talk without appearing to do so. Mrs. Harris greeted him with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "It's a shame," she said. "He was a nice man. Quiet." "Quiet people still have stories," Hamish replied. She hesitated, then nodded. He always asked after the weather, not just what it was doing, but what it meant, whether it would last. "Did that strike you as odd?" "At first. Then I thought perhaps he had reason." Hamish let the thought settle between them like dust. At the hotel, Mr. Macbeth was more forthcoming than usual. He poured Hamish a cup of coffee he had not asked for, and leaned across the bar. He sat in the same place every time, he said, near the fire, but not too near, as if he didn't trust it to behave. Did he talk to anyone? Listened more than talked. But when he did speak, it was as though he was checking something off. "Checking what?" Mr. Macbeth frowned. "People, maybe? Or places?" Hamish thanked him and moved on, his route forming itself without conscious effort. He found Mrs. McLean hanging washing indoors, the terrier curled at her feet. He liked the quiet, she said before he could ask. Said it helped him think. "Think about what?" She shrugged. "He never said. But he asked me once if I believed people could choose where they belonged." Hamish felt the familiar tightening behind his eyes. That came when something nearly made sense. At the post office, Mrs. Wallace had already prepared herself. She spoke briskly, as though efficiency might keep emotion at bay. "He sent letters," she said. "Not many. Always addressed carefully. Always paid extra for tracking, though he never asked if they arrived. Where were they going? Different places. Cities, mostly. All in the south." Hamish thanked her and stepped outside into the brittle cold. He had gathered no facts of legal importance, and yet the shape of the man's life was beginning to emerge, not in events, but in intentions. That afternoon he returned to the old house. This time he moved more slowly, allowing himself to notice what he had overlooked before. The house was sparsely furnished, but not carelessly so. Everything had a purpose. Nothing lingered without reason. In the kitchen drawer he found a small stack of envelopes, unposted. They were addressed, but not sealed. The handwriting was careful, precise. Each bore a different name. Hamish did not read them. He did not need to. The act of writing had been important. The sending, less so. In the sitting room, he noticed a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It showed a younger version of the stranger standing beside a woman, both of them smiling at something just out of frame. The photograph had been placed deliberately, but there was no sign it had been recently dusted. In the bedroom, beneath the bed, he found a suitcase. It was half-packed, clothes folded with care, a pair of walking shoes unworn. Hamish sat on the edge of the bed and let the room speak. It did not tell him what had happened. It told him what had been hoped for. When he left the house, the light was already fading. The village waited below, smoke rising, lamps being lit. It looked, he thought, very much like something one might choose. That evening, Hamish stopped by the hotel. He did not ask questions. He listened. People spoke of a stranger as though he had been there longer than he was. They remembered him into belonging. It occurred to Hamish then that the mystery was not why the man had died where he did, but why he had come at all. And the answer, he suspected, was not one that could be written into a report. Some people, he thought, came to locked up not to disappear, but to arrive somewhere quietly. Snow fell again in the night, a fresh, unassuming layer that softened what had already been softened before. By morning it seemed as though the village had been carefully wrapped, not to preserve it, but to give it time. the sort of time that allowed things to settle into their proper places. Hamish walked down to the harbour after breakfast, though there was little reason to. The water lay still and dark, edged with thin ice that cracked faintly as the tide shifted. He stood for a while, hands in his pockets, letting the quiet do its work. When he turned back, he did so with a sense not of decision exactly, but of readiness. The stranger's name arrived that day in the most unremarkable fashion possible. Mrs. Wallace called him over just as he was, passing the post office, waving a folded form in one hand. "I was going through the registry," she said, with the air of someone who did not expect to be questioned about why, making sure everything was in order. "And Hamish asked, and his name was Alastair Fraser. Or at least, that's the name he used." "Used?" Hamish echoed gently. She hesitated. There was a notation, change of address, change of name, done properly, mind you. All the forms in order. But not long ago. Hamish thanked her and continued on his way, turning the name over in his mind. It fit the man as he remembered him solid, unassuming, unlikely to draw attention. A name that could settle into a place without disturbing it. At the hotel, the name caused a mild stir. Mr. McPhee nodded thoughtfully. "Fraser," he said. "Highland enough." "Aye," said someone at the bar, "but no kin of ours." "That doesn't mean much," Hamish replied. "Plenty of Frasers about." The conversation drifted, as conversations did, but the name lingered. People began to attach it to their memories, refining them. The stranger became Alasdair, no longer an outline, but a person with edge. That afternoon, Hamish returned once more to the old house, this time with a purpose that felt almost intrusive. He opened the desk in the sitting room, which he had left untouched before. Inside, he found papers arranged in neat stacks, bank statements, receipts. Nothing remarkable, but at the bottom drawer there was a slim folder tied with string. He untied it carefully. Inside were documents that spoke of endings rather than beginnings, medical letters, appointments kept and missed, prognoses written in a language that pretended at certainty while offering none. The date spanned several months, all recent. Hamish sat back in the chair, the weight of it settling over him. There had been no mystery about the man's death, not in the medical sense. What had been unclear was everything around it. Tucked among the papers was a single notebook. Its pages were filled with observations, written in the same careful hand as the envelopes. Not a diary. Exactly. More, a record of small things. Mrs. Harris hums when she counts change. The dog prefers the path by the burn. Snow sounds different here. Hamish closed the notebook gently. It was not evidence. It was explanation. In the kitchen, he found a list pinned to the wall. Groceries, mostly. But at the bottom, written smaller, were 3 words. Stay. Rest. Decide. Hamish left the house as he had found it, locking the door behind him. The village lay before him, unchanged and yet subtly altered by understanding. That evening, the weather drove people indoors early. At the hotel, the fire burned brighter than usual, and chairs were drawn closer together. The conversation turned, as it inevitably did, to a He was ill, then, Mrs. McLean said softly. Yes, Hamish replied. That's why he stayed? Partly. Why here? Someone asked. Hamish considered the faces around him, the familiar lines, the shared history that needed no explanation. Because here, he said slowly, no one asks too many questions if you don't want them answered. There was a murmur of agreement. Logdeb prided itself on its discretion. Later, walking home through the snow, Hamish thought of the list on the kitchen wall. Stay, rest, decide. Perhaps the man had come to decide something that could only be decided in quiet. Perhaps the decision had been made, and the rest was simply waiting. As Hamish reached the police station, he paused and looked back at the village. Lights glowed warmly. Smoky? Rosy. Somewhere, a door opened and closed, letting out a brief burst of laughter. Whatever secrets locked up kept, it kept them gently. And whatever Alastair Fraser had been seeking, he had found enough of it to stay. The thought settled over Hamish, like the snow itself, soft, persistent, and not entirely unwelcome. The days that followed did not hurry themselves. Loctave rarely did, and there was no reason now to begin. The snow remained, though it thinned at the edges, retreating from doorsteps and stone walls, as if conceding small compromises. Life resumed its shape, but the stranger Alastair now had taken up a quiet residence in the village's collective mind. Hamish noticed how often people found reasons to mention him, not with grief exactly, but with a reflective gentleness, as though speaking his name allowed them to place something unnamed within themselves. At the shop, Mrs. Harris kept aside a loaf of bread she no longer needed to reserve. She stared at it for a moment before putting it back on the shelf. He liked the oat one, she said, unnecessarily. He did, Hamish agreed. At the hotel, the chair near the fire remained empty, though others were available. No one said anything about it. Mr. McPhee polished glasses and glanced toward the hearth, more often than required. Hamish let these things accumulate without comment. He had learned that people revealed more in repetition than in confession. One afternoon, as the light thinned toward evening, Hamish received a call from the solicitor in the nearest town. It was brief and polite. Alastair Fraser had left instructions. Simple ones. No family named. A small sum set aside for arrangements. The remainder to be divided among several charities, none local. "And the house?" Hamish asked. "Leased," the solicitor replied. 6 months paid in advance, and soon. Hamish thanked him and hung up, feeling a faint dissatisfaction that surprised him. It was all too orderly. Endings usually were when someone had time to prepare. That evening he walked again toward the edge of the village, stopping not at the house itself, but at the path that led past it and into the hills. Snow muffled his steps. The air smelt clean and faintly metallic. From there, the village looked smaller, closer together, as though bracing itself against the dark. He wondered how often Alastair had stood in this same place, whether he had looked back with relief or forward with uncertainty. The following day brought the matter that shifted everything not with force, but with inevitability. Mrs. McLean arrived at the police station carrying a folded scarf. She sat down without being invited, her terrier unusually subdued. "I've been thinking," she said, "about that man Hamish waited. He asked me something not long before. Well, he asked if people ever became what others needed them to be, even when they didn't start that way." Hamish frowned slightly. "What did you say?" "I said people do it all the time, especially in small places. You fill gaps without noticing." She handed him the scarf. It was wool, neatly knitted, the sort of thing one made without hurry. "He left this on my gate. I thought at first it was a mistake, but then I remembered he'd asked me once what color suited me best." Hamish turned the scarf over in his hands. There was nothing remarkable about it. That was what made it matter. Later that day, Mrs. Harris admitted that Alasdair had once insisted on paying for a woman's groceries when her purse came up short, though he had done so by pretending it was his mistake. Mr. McPhee recalled how Alasdair always chose the same soup, not because it was his favorite, but because it was what the kitchen made best. Small kindnesses, quiet adjustments, the sort that went unnoticed at the time. Hamish began to see a pattern that had nothing to do with illness or escape. Alasdair had not merely been resting. He had been arranging something, not materially, but socially, inserting himself gently where he could, then stepping back. That night, Hamish returned to the notebook he had taken from the house. He had not read it through before. Now he did, slowly. Among the observations were questions. Who needs quiet? Who pretends they don't? Who will be missed without knowing why? On the final page, there was a single line written more firmly than the rest. Belonging is not claimed, it is granted. Hamish closed the book and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The caisif, it could still be called, that was shifting away from death and toward intention. Alasdair had not come to Logdiv simply to die. He had come to place himself somewhere, however briefly, where his presence might matter in small ways. The village, without realizing it, had accepted him. The funeral was held 2 days later, modest and unassuming. The church was fuller than anyone had expected. People arrived unsure of their own reasons, then stayed because leaving felt wrong. Hamish stood at the back, watching his heads bowed as coats brushed against one another, as the village gathered itself around an absence. Afterward, as they stepped back into the cold, no one hurried away. Conversations lingered. Someone suggested tea. Someone else agreed too quickly. As Hamish walked home later, dusk settling in, he felt the case narrowing not toward a culprit, but toward a truth that was almost uncomfortable in its simplicity. Alasdair Fraser had come to Lochtab to see whether he could belong somewhere without explanation, and in doing so he had left behind something the village would only slowly understand, that even strangers could alter the shape of a place, if they stayed long enough to be noticed and kind enough not to demand it. The snow began to fall again, light and deliberate, as if marking time rather than erasing it. The village changed after the funeral, though only in the ways that revealed themselves if one knew where to look. The chair by the fire at the hotel was no longer avoided, but neither was it claimed. People sat near it, not in it, as though leaving room for a conversation that had not quite finished. Hamish noticed these things because he had always noticed such things. It was, after all, how he worked, not by interrogating, but by allowing people to reveal themselves at their own pace. A week passed. The snow withdrew further, uncovering stone and grass beneath. The burn began to run louder, freed from its icy restraint. Lochtab breathed again. It was on one of these clearer mornings that Hamish found himself walking toward the old house with a sense of unfinished business. Not professional, there was nothing left to resolve in that sense but personal, in the way that stories sometimes lingered after their endings. Inside, the house felt different now, emptier, certainly, but also quieter, as though it had accepted its role and was done with it. Hamish moved through the rooms slowly, not searching so much as listening. In the bedroom, he noticed something he had overlooked before. The curtains. They had been carefully pinned back, allowing light in even on gray days. It struck Hamish as an intentional act, someone who expected to be there long enough to care about the morning. He moved to the kitchen, where the list still hung on the wall. Stay, rest, decide. The words had faded slightly, as though they had been touched often. It was then that Hamish saw what he had missed. Pinned beneath the list was a smaller scrap of paper, almost hidden. He eased it free. It was a timetable. Not for buses or trains, but for people. Names were written in the same careful hand. Mrs. Harris, Mr. McPhee, Mrs. McLean. Beside each name were notes brief, observational, prefers afternoons, needs listening, not advice, doesn't like to be thanked. At the bottom of the page was Hamish's own name, asks less than he knows. Hamish exhaled slowly. The room felt suddenly crowded with understanding. Alastair had been measuring time not in days, but in encounters. He had structured his remaining life around moments of connection, chosen and deliberate, not dramatic, not self-important, simply present. That afternoon, Hamish carried the paper back with him, folded carefully in his pocket. He did not show it to anyone. Some things were not meant to be shared. Instead, he watched. He watched Mrs. Harris pause before speaking, as if considering whether her words were necessary or merely habitual. "Hi!" "Watch, Mr. McPhee refill a glass without being asked. Then he stepped back, allowing silence to do its work. He watched Mrs. McLean sit longer on her bench by the road, her terrier asleep at her feet. None of them knew why they had begun to behave slightly differently. They only knew that something felt adjusted. The solicitor called again later that week. The house would be vacated soon. The lease would end quietly. There were no instructions regarding personal effects beyond disposal. Hamish stood in the doorway of the old house that evening, keys heavy in his hand. He thought of the suitcase under the bed, half-packed, the walking shoes unworn. He locked the door and returned the keys the next day. Winter loosened its grip. Snow became memory rather than presence. The village shifted toward spring with cautious optimism. And then, just when Hamish thought the story had settled into itself, the smallest disturbance rippled through it. Mrs. Wallace came to him with a question that was not really a question at all. "There's something I can't quite place," she said. "It's been bothering me." Hamish waited. "The letters?" she said. "The ones he sent? I know where they went. I know who received them. And they weren't friends or family. They were acquaintances, people he'd known briefly, places he'd passed through." Hamish nodded. "What did they say?" "They weren't asking for anything. They were thanking people for small things." The pieces aligned with a quiet finality. That night, Hamish sat at his desk long after the village had gone dark. He took out his report, the one that had already been filed and forgotten, and added a note to the margin. Not official, just personal. Subject displayed no intent of concealment. Presence appears to have been deliberate, measured, and finite. He closed the file and did not reopen it. As he prepared for bed, Hamish looked out at the village one last time. Lights glimmered. A door opened. Laughter drifted briefly into the cold air. Alastair Fraser had not come to Logdab to be saved, Hamish realized. He had come to see whether he could leave something behind without making a demand. And in that, perhaps, he had succeeded. The village slept on, unaware that it had been changed not by a crime, but by a choice quietly made and carefully kept. By the time spring made a proper attempt at the Highlands, Logdab had begun to behave as though nothing of note had ever happened. That was its way. Events were absorbed, smoothed down, and tucked neatly into memory, where they could be taken out later and examined at leisure or not. Hamish, however, found that the story refused to lie still. It showed itself not in facts, but in hesitations, in the moments when people paused, adjusted, chose differently. Mrs. Harris stopped correcting customers who miscounted their change. She simply smiled and made the difference disappear. Mr. McPhee replaced a cracked chair at the hotel without comment, though no one had complained. Mrs. McLean began leaving her gate unlatched, as though expecting someone who never arrived. These were not habits formed overnight. They were responses subtle, unspoken, to something that had passed through the village and left an impression too gentle to name. Hamish walked his usual routes, listening. What did ye heard more often than not were explanations people offered themselves. He was lonely, someone said, as though that accounted for everything. He came here to die. Another insisted, uncomfortable with the idea that it might not be the whole truth. He didn't want trouble, said a third, with a note of approval. Each version simplified the story. Each one missed something essential. Hamish did not correct them. People needed their myths. They smoothed the rough edges of understanding. Still, there were moments when the village's careful narrative faltered. It happened one afternoon at the shop, when a young woman from a neighboring village came in asking about rooms to let. Mrs. Harris shook her head automatically. Nothing suitable, she said, then stopped. Well, there is the old house. The woman smiled politely. I heard someone die there. Mrs. Harris stiffened. Peacefully, said, and it's a good house. The exchange lingered in the air after the woman left. That evening, Hamish stopped by the hotel. The fire burned low, the room comfortably full. He took his usual seat, accepting a drink without asking for it. He wouldn't like this fuss, Mr. McPhee said suddenly, nodding toward the hum of conversation. Who? Hamish asked, though he knew. The stranger. Alasdair. Hamish. Consider. I think he would have understood it. Mr. McPhee frowned. You think he planned it, then? All this remembering. No, Hamish said gently. I think he allowed it. That was the difference. Planning required control. Allowing required trust. Later, as Hamish walked home, he passed the old house. The lights were off now, the windows dark. Without the signs of occupation, it reverted easily to its former state just. Another quiet building on the edge of things, and yet Hamish felt its presence more keenly than before. He stopped, listening to the wind move through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. It occurred to him then that the one question no one had asked was also this: what if Alasdair had not come to Lochtab to belong? What if he had come to see whether belonging was still possible? The thought unsettled him more than he expected. Belonging, after all, was something the village took for granted. It was inherited, assumed, rarely examined. Perhaps that was why Alasdair's presence had mattered. He had approached the village without entitlement, without demand. He had treated belonging not as a right, but as a gift that might or might not be offered. And Lochtab, without realizing it, had offered it. The following day brought a small but telling incident. Mrs. Wallace arrived at the police station holding a bundle of letters tied with string. These came back, she said. Forwarding address expired. Hamish took the bundle, already knowing what it was. I thought perhaps. She trailed off. Well, perhaps they should be kept. For whom? Hamish asked. She looked embarrassed. For us, maybe. Hamish nodded. I'll take care of them. He did not open the letters. He placed them in the same drawer as the notebook, the timetable, the scraps of understanding that had no official place. That evening, the village gathered for a meeting about the upcoming festival. Dates were discussed. Tasks assigned. Arguments resolved with familiar efficiency. At one point, someone suggested naming a stall after the stranger. The idea was met with polite discomfort and quickly abandoned. Hamish watched it all with quiet interest. The village was not ready to claim him openly. That was all right. Some things took longer. As the meeting ended, people lingered. Chairs were stacked slowly. Conversations softened. Hamish stepped outside into the cool night. The stars were sharp and numerous, the sky untroubled by cloud. He thought of Alastair's notebook, of the questions written there. Who will be missed without knowing why? The answer, he realized, was not the stranger. It was the village. Locked Up would miss something. It could not quite name a way of seeing itself reflected briefly in someone who did not need it, but noticed it anyway. Hamish walked home with that thought settling beside him, companionable and unresolved. The story, he knew now, was not about death. It was about the quiet myths people told themselves to avoid looking too closely at the choices they made every day. And, like all good village stories, it would not end cleanly. It would simply fade into habit, into kindness, into the small adjustments that went unnoticed but endured. The old house remained dark, but in the village below, lights burned on. Spring arrived not all at once, but in increments that required attention to notice. A crocus appeared beside the church wall. The burn ran clearer, quicker. Someone left the window open overnight and did not regret it in the morning. Locked Up accepted these signs with quiet approval. Hamish felt the season change most acutely in the evenings. Light lingered longer, softening the edges of the village and blurring the boundary between day and night. It was during one of these drawn-out twilights that the final piece settled into place, not with revelation, but with recognition. He had gone to the hotel out of habit rather than intention. The room was half full. The usual collection of locals spread comfortably apart. Conversation ebbed and flowed, punctuated by the clink of glasses and the low murmur of the fire. Near the hearth, two women sat, talking in subdued tones. One was a visitor passing through on her way north. The other was Mrs. McLean. "I don't know why I stayed," the visitor was saying. "I only meant to stop for tea." Then the weather turned, and before I knew it, she shrugged, smiling faintly. Mrs. McLean nodded, her expression attentive but Sometimes places decide for you. Hamish felt a familiar tightening, not of suspicion, but of clarity. Later, as he walked home, he took the longer route, skirting the edge of the village where the old house lay quiet. He did not stop this time. He did not need to. What had troubled him, he realized, was not the absence of a crime, but the presence of intention that had gone unacknowledged. Alasdair had not merely observed the village, he had responded to it, adjusted himself to its rhythms, offered small kindnesses where they would do the most good and the least harm. In doing so, he had revealed something about Locked Up itself. The village liked to believe it was welcoming, and it was but on its own terms. It welcomed those who fitted easily, who arrived with history or purpose that could be understood at a glance. Alasdair had arrived without either. He had asked, without words, a more difficult question. "Would you still make room for me if I am temporary?" The answer, it seemed, had been yes, but not without consequence. The following day, Hamish returned to the police station earlier than usual. He opened the drawer where he had placed the notebook, the letters, the timetable. He laid them out on the desk, studying them not as clues, but as gestures. The notebook was worn now, its spine softened by use. The observations within were gentle, perceptive, occasionally amused. There was no bitterness there, no sense of grievance, only attention. He turned to the last pages again, lingering on the final question. who will be missed without knowing why. Hamish closed the notebook and pushed his chair back. That afternoon he walked through the village with a purpose he did not fully articulate. He spoke to Mrs. Harris about nothing in particular. He thanked Mr. Macbeth for a drink he had not yet poured. He stopped to talk to Mrs. Wallace, listening as she worried aloud about the summer turnout for the festival. Each conversation ended the same way, with a pause, a shared moment of ease, something unspoken but understood. It struck Hamish then that Alastair had not left behind a mystery to be solved, but a mirror. The village was seeing itself, just slightly refracted, and it did not quite know what to do with the image. In the weeks that followed, the old house was let again. A retired couple from the south took it, pleased with the view, grateful for the quiet. They brought their own furniture, their own routines. The house adapted easily. Life moved on. And yet, people found themselves doing things differently, leaving gates open, sitting longer with one another, asking questions they had previously assumed answers to. No one attributed these changes to Alastair Fraser. That would have been too direct, too unsettling. Instead, they spoke of the season of age, of the weather. Hamish let them on a mild evening near the end of spring. He sat on the low wall by the harbour, watching the water shift and reflect the sky. He thought of the man who had stood there before him, considering the village from a slight distance, deciding whether to step closer or remain apart. Belonging, Hamish understood now, was not a permanent state. It was a series of small permissions, granted and renewed. Alastair had come to Lochtub to see whether those permissions still existed for him. For anyone, the village had granted them, quietly, without ceremony. And in doing so, it had been changed not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. Hamish stood and brushed snowmelt from his coat. The evening stretched ahead, calm and unremarkable. Some stories ended with answers. This one, he thought, ended with an understanding the village would carry forward without ever quite naming it, and perhaps that was the truest kind of resolution. Lochtub knew summer edged its way into Lochtub with characteristic restraint. The hills softened into green, and the days lengthened until evening felt less like an ending and more like a continuation that happened to grow dimmer. The village adjusted, as it always did, without comment. Hamish found that his routines shifted almost imperceptibly. He walked a little farther in the mornings. He lingered a little longer at the shop. He listened, as he always had, but now with a heightened awareness of the spaces between words. It was in one of those spaces that the final practical matter arose. This lister wrote again, this time with a note of mild uncertainty. There was an item listed among Alastair Fraser's effects that had no clear instruction attached to it. The notebook up it, apparently, and sent nor for safekeeping rather than destruction. Would the constable prefer to collect it? The letter asked. Hamish did not hesitate. He travelled the next day, returning by evening with the slim book tucked carefully into his bag. The village greeted him as though he had never left, which was, in its way, an answer. That night he sat at his desk and read the notebook from beginning to end, not as an investigator, but as a neighbor. The earlier entries were cautious, almost clinical. Notes about weather, roads, the rhythm of the shop. Over time, the tone softened. Observations grew warmer, more specific. They do not rush grief here. Silence is not absence. Kindness is offered sideways. Near the end, there was a longer passage, written less neatly than the rest. I thought I had lost the right to belong anywhere, that by leaving one life unfinished, I had forfeited the rest. But belonging it seems, is not a reward. It is an agreement entered into quietly, without witnesses. Hamish closed the notebook, feeling as though he had been entrusted with something delicate. The following day, he did something uncharacteristic. He spoke, not publicly, not formally, but in small, deliberate ways. At the shop, he mentioned that the notebook existed not its contents, only its presence. Mrs. Harris listened, nodding slowly, as though confirming something she had suspected. At the hotel, he told Mr. Macbeth that Alasdair had been grateful for the soup, that it had meant more than he let on. Mr. Macbeth grunted, but his eyes soft. "Two Misses. McLean," he returned the scarf, now folded and clean. "He meant you to keep it," Hamish said. She held it for a long moment, then nodded. I thought as much." These were not revelations. They were acknowledgments. The village absorbed them with the same quiet competence it applied to everything else. Later that week, the festival preparations reached their familiar crescendo. Stalls were planned, arguments resolved, old grievances resurfaced and were put aside once more. In the midst of it, Mrs. Wallace paused over the list of names assigned to tasks. "There's a gap here," she said, "between McLean and Macbeth." Hamish glanced at the list. "Is there?" She tapped the paper. "There used to be someone." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Wallace drew a neat line through the space, not erasing it, but marking it. "That will do," she said. On the day of the festival, the village was full. Visitors came and went. Music played. Children ran. Hamish stood near the edge of it all, watching as he always did. He noticed how people spoke more gently to strangers, how they offered directions without impatience, how they allowed others to linger without explanation. No one spoke Alasdair's name. They did not need to. As evening settled and the crowd thinned, Hamish walked once more toward the harbour. The light lay low on the water, turning it the colour of old silver. He thought of the man who had arrived quietly, stayed through the snow, and left without disturbance. The village would not tell his story as a mystery. There would be no cautionary tale, no lesson drawn out and polished. Instead, there would be habits, adjustments, a slightly widened sense of who might belong. Hamish leaned against the wall, content in a way that felt earned rather than given. Some people, he reflected, solved mysteries by uncovering hidden acts. Others solved them by recognizing the visible ones for what they were. Alasdair Fraser's final act had not been his death. It had been his staying. And Loch Deb, without ever agreeing aloud, had answered him in kind. Summer edged its way into Loch Deb with characteristic restraint. The hills softened into green, and the days lengthened until evening felt less like an ending and more like a continuation that happened to grow dimmer. The village adjusted, as it always did, without comment. Hamish found that his routines shifted almost He lingered a little longer at the shop. He listened, as he always had, but now with a heightened awareness of the spaces between words. It was in one of those spaces that the final practical matter arose. The solicitor wrote again, this time with a note of mild uncertainty. There was an item listed among Alasdair Fraser's effects that had no clear instruction attached to it. The notebook copied, apparently, and sent north for safekeeping rather than destruction. Would the constable prefer to collect it? The letter asked. Hamish did not hesitate. He travelled the next day, returning by evening with the slim book tucked carefully into his bag. The village greeted him as though he had never left, which was, in its way, an answer. That night he sat at his desk and read the notebook from beginning to end, not as an investigator, but as a neighbor. The earlier entries were cautious, almost clinical, notes about weather, roads, the rhythm of the shop. Over time, the tone softened. Observations grew warmer, more specific. They do not rush grief here. Silence is not absence. Kindness is offered sideways. Near the end, there was a longer passage, written less neatly than the rest. I thought I had lost the right to belong anywhere. That by leaving one life unfinished, I had forfeited the rest. But belonging, it seems, is not a reward. It is an agreement entered into quietly without witnesses. Hamish closed the notebook, feeling as though he had been entrusted with something delicate. The following day, he did something uncharacteristic. He spoke, not publicly, not formally, but in small, deliberate ways. At the shop, he mentioned that the notebook existed not its contents, only its presence. Mrs. Harris listened, nodding slowly, as though confirming something she had suspected. At the hotel, he told Mr. Macbeth that Alastair had been grateful for the soup, that it had meant more than he let on. Mr. Macbeth grunted, but his eyes softened. To Mrs. McLean, he returned the scarf, now folded and clean. "He meant you to keep it," Hamish said. She held it for a long moment, then nodded. I thought as much. These were not revelations. They were acknowledgments. The village absorbed them with the same quiet competence it applied to everything else. Later that week, the festival preparations reached their familiar crescendo. Stalls were planned, arguments resolved, old grievances resurfaced and were put aside once more. In the midst of it, Mrs. Wallace paused over the list of names assigned to tasks. "There's a gap here," she said, "between McLean and Macbeth." Hamish glanced at the list. "Is there?" She tapped the paper. "There used to be someone." They stood in silence for a moment. "Then Mrs." Wallace drew a neat line through the space, not erasing it, but marking it. "That will do," she said. On the day of the festival, the village was full. Visitors came and went. Music played. Children ran. Hamish stood near the edge of it all, watching as he always did. He noticed how people spoke more gently to strangers, how they offered directions without impatience, how they allowed others to linger without explanation. No one spoke Alastair's name. They did not need to. As evening settled and the crowd thinned, Hamish walked once more toward the harbor. The light lay low on the water, turning it the color of old silver. He thought of the man who had arrived quietly, stayed through the snow, and left without disturbance. The village would not tell his story as a mystery. There would be no cautionary tale, no lesson drawn out and polished. Instead, there would be habits, adjustments, a slightly widened sense of who might belong. Hamish leaned against the wall, content in a way that felt earned rather than given. Some people, he reflected, solved mysteries by uncovering hidden acts. Others solved them by recognizing the visible ones for what they were. Alastair Fraser's final act had not been his death. It had been his sting, and Lochtab, without ever agreeing aloud, had answered him in kind. The village settled into late summer with the ease of something that had learned long ago not to rush what would arrive anyway. The hills deepened in color. The air held warmth without insistence. Evenings stretched unhurried and forgiving. In Lochtab, nothing marked the passing of the stranger's season. There was no plaque, no story formalized into anecdote. His name surfaced less often now, and when it did, it was spoken gently, as one might speak of weather that had been particularly kind. Hamish took comfort in that. He had always believed that villages remembered what mattered and forgot what did not. The trick was that remembrance rarely took the form people expected. It did not announce itself. It altered behavior. It shifted the angle at which things were done. One evening, as the light thinned toward dusk, Hamish walked the long way home, past the harbour and up along the road that curved toward the hills. The old house was quiet, but no longer empty in the way it once had been. A lamp glowed in one of the front rooms now. Someone lived there again. Someone with their own reasons for staying. He paused for a moment, listening to the low murmur of the village behind him. Laughter drifted on the air. A door closed. Somewhere, music played softly, then stopped. It occurred to him that this was how most lives passed through places, not loudly, not with ceremony, but with a series of small imprints that only became visible once they were gone. Alastair Fraser had not changed Lochtab in any way that could be measured. He had not altered its customs, its rhythms, its certainties. What he had done was subtler. He had arrived without expectation. He had stayed without demand. And in doing so, he had reminded the village of something it had nearly forgotten, that belonging was an act of mutual attention, renewed quietly, day by day. The thought stayed with Hamish as he continued on, the road narrowing, the hills opening out around him. The sky above was pale and wide, the sort that made one feel both small and held at the same time. The following week brought rain, steady and unremarkable. The village welcomed it. Gardens drank deeply. The burn swelled again, lively but contained. At the shop, Mrs. Harris asked after Hamish's health, and waited for the answer rather than filling the silence herself. At the hotel, Mr. McPhee listened to a visitor's story without interrupting, nodding at all the right moments. These were not new behaviors. They were simply more intentional. Hamish did his work, as he always had. Papers were filed. Minor disputes were resolved. Lost items were found, or not, as the case might be. Nothing of note crossed his desk, and yet he felt no sense of anticlimax. Some mysteries, he knew, concluded not with resolution, but with absorption. They became part of the background against which other lives unfolded. One afternoon, he took out the notebook one last time. He did not read it. Only held it, feeling the weight of it in his hand. Then he placed it back in the drawer and closed it for good. That evening, the village gathered without planning to do so. Someone brought out chairs. Someone else produced a bottle. Conversation drifted and recombined, easy and familiar. Hamish stood at the edge of it, content to observe. A stranger passed through another one, this time only staying a night. Directions were offered. Questions were asked, but gently. No one pressed. No one assumed. The stranger smiled, relieved, and settled in. Hamish watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. It was not that Lochtab had become different. It was that it had remembered itself. As night fell, the village lights came on one by one, reflected in puddles left by the rain. The hills beyond lay dark and patient, unchanged by any of it. Hamish walked home under a sky clearing of cloud, stars beginning to show. He felt no urge to look back. The story was complete not because every question had been answered, but because the right ones had been asked and allowed to remain open. Somewhere in the fabric of the village, a space existed that had not been there before. Not an emptiness, but a margin. Room enough for someone to arrive quietly, stay briefly, and leave without disturbance. Room enough for secrets. Hamish unlocked his door and stepped inside, the warmth meeting him as expected. He set the kettle on, listening to the familiar sounds of his own small life continuing. Outside, Lockdub settled into the night, holding what it had learned without announcing it. And if the village still got its secrets, all villagers did so with the steady, patient understanding that some truths were not meant to be solved, only lived with.